Hello everyone, this is Matt from Real World Review, and today I'm going to be replacing the back glass on the iPhone 11 Pro. Just so you know, this is pretty much like the iPhone 11 Pro Max, just a little bit smaller, obviously. Also, the glass that we're going to be using goes over the camera lens area, so you don't have to remove the actual camera area. This is going to make a little bit more sense as we go on into the video, and the correct parts are going to be in the description below. So the tools you're going to need are going to be a PH000 Bit, a Y000 Bit, a P2 driver, a standoff bit, a razor blade, a pick, and an Xacto knife. We're also going to need some heat, as well as some glue, clamps, and some protective gear like this UV glove, as well as some eye protection. And so the first thing we're going to do is grab the P2 driver and remove the bottom two screws, and then we're going to carefully lift up the screen. So I like to add a little bit of heat around the edges and use a razor blade to lift up the bottom portion, and then cut through the adhesive on that, and then cut through the adhesive on the right and on the left side. Lastly, we're going to cut through the adhesive on the top, and we're going to carefully lift up the screen just a little bit and move it over to the right side like this. Next, we're going to unplug the battery, so we're going to remove these two screws right here, and remove this little metal piece right here. And then we're going to use that to remove these three screws on the left side, and then the three screws on the right side, and remove this little metal panel right here. Next, we use a pick to unplug the screen, and unplug the top cables as well. Next, we can remove these two screws on the top near the camera area, as well as this little metal piece that goes over these little cables. Then we're going to remove the other screws that go over the camera area, and then we're going to carefully lift up this camera cover. So we're going to unplug the charging port cables, the one on the top and the one on the left, and just lift it up just a little bit like this, and we're going to unplug all the other cables that are on this top area, including the Face ID cable and the camera cables. Next, we're going to grab the standoff bit and remove those screws on the top two, and then the one on the right. And while we're at it, let's remove the SIM card tray. And then we're going to carefully lift up this logic board, starting with the little SIM card area, and then it should just come out fairly easily. Now we can grab the Y000 bit to remove these screws on the side and remove this little metal piece, so then the charging port cable is a little bit more accessible. While we have that bit, we can remove these screws right here, and put this little metal piece in that area as well. Then we can switch to the PH000 bit, remove all the screws you can see down there. Sorry that it's a little bit out of the camera, but ultimately you'll be able to see all those screws. And then we can remove those standoff bits that go on the top of that little charging port extra area, I guess. As well as unplugging those cables that plug into that charging port extra area. We can lift up the speaker like this, and it should just come out fairly easily. As well as that Taptic engine once it's unplugged. And then there's a little metal piece that was under the Taptic engine, can just be removed like this. Then we can grab the standoff bit and remove those other screws, and the Y000 bit to remove that screw right there. The PH000 bit to carefully remove the bottom two screws, those can be a little bit difficult. The Y000 bit to remove the screw on the left side, and then the charging port should come out once you remove this other screw on the right side. And pretty much you just lift it up like this. Be very careful. One, these cables are very expensive, and two, they're a pain to replace. So feel free to add some heat and use a pick to lift up the adhesive areas. Then just like the other phones, you want to remove the microphone area carefully with a razor blade to separate it from the frame. And it should just come out fairly easily. Next, we're going to remove the battery, which is always a pain. You have to use these little pull tabs, which Apple almost hides, and makes it very difficult. Generally, what I end up doing is I end up either getting one to work or breaking them all, but either way, I'm going to show you how to remove those. So carefully try to remove them. I recommend getting at least one of them to come out, whether it's on the top or whether it's on the bottom. Hopefully it's on the top, because the top makes it a little bit easier. And then if you're lucky, you'll be able to pull them out and then just lift up the battery. But if not, you could just add a little bit of heat and then it should just come out. For me, I got lucky and just removed the pull tabs. Next thing we're going to do is grab this little plastic cover piece and we're going to remove that. And we're just going to set it off to the side. Then we're going to grab the Face ID and remove that. Just move it down to the bottom. Then we're going to grab the PH000 bit and remove these screws over here. Then carefully what we're going to do is remove the wireless charging panel. I added a little bit of heat, but what we want to do is just cut through the adhesive. But you do want to be very careful because it is connected to the volume buttons on the side. Feel free to add some heat if you want to, just so then you don't tear this cable. But essentially what you want to do is lift up the wireless charging and just kind of remove it from the phone and remove the volume buttons as well. Volume button should kind of come out fairly easily. It's just this little silent switch that may be a little bit of a pain. But eventually the silent switch will come out. Just make sure that that little switch stays in place, obviously. Next thing I'm going to do is simply just remove the camera. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this little antenna piece. So I'm going to grab the PH000 bit, remove the power button area, and then grab the Y000 bit to remove these two screws that go over the microphone. Then we're going to carefully lift out that microphone. It can be a little bit of a pain to do, but be very careful not to obviously tear that cable, but eventually it should just come out with some prying. You can use some heat if you want to, but for me it doesn't really make too much of a difference. Eventually it'll lift out like this, and then we can kind of move this cable over to the side, remove this screw right here, and then this little metal piece should kind of lift up like this. Now we can push out the little camera flash and carefully start removing the cable again. And there's going to be another screw that we have to remove with the Y000 bit, and another screw on the top with the PH000 bit. Then we can loosen up this little cable up here, and then finally lift all this stuff out and put it over to the side. So next we're going to loosen up this little antenna cable right here. So we're going to grab the Y000 bit, remove this screw on the top, remove these little two screws and that little retainer on the left, as well as the other screw that goes up here, and that little metal piece that you want to make sure that you know exactly where that goes. Then grab the PH000 bit, remove this screw on the top. Then we're going to grab the Y000 bit again and remove this screw right here. And yes, there are two more screws attached to that cable on the right side with that Y000 bit. Something I didn't realize until I started doing it. Now we can heat up this little antenna area and kind of lift it up just very carefully. What I recommend is using a razor blade to get under there, and then just use a pick to cut through the rest of the adhesive. And then you want to do the same thing with that antenna on the top. That one's held in a little bit easier, so you can kind of just lift it up like this, and then it should just come out. So now we're pretty much done with tearing down the phone, so what we're going to do is start removing the back glass. So what I recommend doing is trying to remove this little microphone area before you do the back glass, but sometimes it is a little bit easier just to do the back glass and then remove this little metal plastic piece, whatever. But either way, be very careful with stuff trying to remove this. You don't want to damage it or anything like that, and you also don't want to damage the tools you are using to remove that, but eventually it will come out. So just remember, it does take some time. Now we're going to put on our protective glove as well as the protective glasses, and we're going to get ready to remove the back glass on this phone. So what we're going to do is just add some heat, and I'm pretty much just going to focus on the bottom first and then move all the way to the top. So this is pretty cracked, so it does make it a little bit easier, at least in my case. But essentially what you want to do is add some heat for about 5 to 10 seconds, and then we're going to use a razor blade to kind of lift up the bottom glass. After about 5 to 10 seconds, if it isn't lifting up very easily, what I like to do is just like to let it sit for a few seconds and then add some more heat for, again, 5 to 10 seconds. We're going to do this over and over again until we can get a decent amount of space for the Xacto knife, and then we're just going to heat it up and use the Xacto knife to remove pretty much all of the glass. I recommend focusing on the middle area rather than on the side areas with this Xacto knife, because you can go back with the razor blade later on once we get all of the back glass off. But ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to just keep using this to remove it. We're going to add some heat when we need to. This one is a little bit easier because most of the adhesive is on the edge, but still I recommend using this knife just in case. And pretty much what we're going to do is we're going to keep doing this until we get all the way to the top, and then we're going to get rid of the glass on the right side, and then we're going to finally focus on the camera lens area. So most of the phone is pretty much clear of glass, so what you can do on the top left where the camera lens area is add some heat and kind of use the blade to kind of go under that and essentially bend the glass so it shatters. This is easier said than done, and sometimes it happens really easily and other times it doesn't. So what I'm doing is I'm just trying to cut through that adhesive so then it makes it a little bit easier when we do more stuff to it. But ultimately what we're going to do is clean up this little area right here so we can add space to add this little piece right here and break the camera glass area. I recommend using something pointed with a hammer. It is fairly difficult to do and fairly annoying. If you have something that can break glass a little bit easier, I recommend using this. Just be careful around the camera lens area and make sure not to bend the camera area too much because you don't want it to make it difficult for the camera to fit back in place. And also you don't want this to kind of fall out of the phone. But either way, keep doing that until you get a bunch of cracks like this. And what you're going to do is just the same thing we were doing with the back, just with the razor blade. You're going to heat up the edges and heat up the middle area, and then you're just going to remove the glass and kind of clean up where the glue area is. This does take some time, and if you use like a very thin flathead, it does make it a little bit easier to get through the middle area, but yeah, it is kind of a pain to do. I normally remove the glass under a microscope. If you have that for higher precision, I highly recommend using that, but I do this for jobs, so I want to make sure that everything looks perfect. So ultimately you're going to get to a point where it looks like this, where it looks clean on the edges and everything's flat and all the glue is gone. And now you're ready to put the back glass on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a line around the edges, and then I'm going to put lines, like squiggly lines, around the little metal area, especially near the camera and especially on the bottom area. You don't want to add too much, but also you want to add, just enough so then the back does stay on. The top area is enough, the bottom area might be a little bit too much, so just add something like this or possibly a little bit more. But again, this is easier to clean up, so you don't have to worry too much about that. And what you're going to do is set the back glass in place, line up the edges, and add some clamps. So what I like to do is add about 5 to 6 clamps on one side, 5 to 6 clamps on the other side, and then 1 to 2 on the top and bottom area. Then what we're going to do is let this sit for 3 hours. Okay, so after we let the phone dry, what we're going to do is we're going to remove the clamps and we're going to remove the adhesive that's around the edge. You don't really have to add anything too crazy. All you can do is just use like your finger or fingernail to remove the adhesive. You can add some rubbing alcohol or maybe a plastic pick if needed, but definitely don't use anything metal. You also don't need to clean it right now, but I'm just going to clean it right now. So the next thing we're going to do is start putting everything back together. So we're going to get all the parts and we're going to get everything set up. There may be some excess glue on the inside. You can just remove that with your fingernail or remove it with your finger and it should just come off fairly easily. You want to make sure most of it is flat, so don't just ignore this. Now we're going to put this top antenna back in. All you got to do is just set it in place and put all the screws that are going in there, like the Y000 screws on the right side, the Y000 screw right here, and the PH000 screws right here. Most of these screws are going to be a mix of PH000 and Y000 screws, but just obviously make sure you know where they go. And make sure all these little pieces go in the right area as well, like this little metal cover and these little antenna grounding covers. Next, we can place the camera flash in the microphone back in place, starting with the camera flash and that little antenna that goes on the top right. And remember, this screw with the little extra thing goes right here, with that extra thing kind of pointing more up. Once that's set in place, you can put this little metal piece that hooks in on the top and pushes down on the bottom. Then you can use a Y000 bit to put in that top screw, as well as the screw that goes above that. Next, you can put this little microphone thing back in place the way that it normally goes, which just kind of sits like this. And we have the little microphone that sits on top of that. That's held in by a little bit of adhesive, but if it's not holding in properly, you can put in that little cover right now. But I'm going to do that later. Right now, I'm going to grab the PH000 bit and I'm going to put in the power button. And obviously, once you put in those two screws, make sure it clicks fine. And if it doesn't click fine, you might have to fix that. Next, we can put the volume buttons and the wireless charging back in place, starting with this little switch on the top. It may be a little bit difficult to put back in, but you kind of just have to maneuver it a little bit and then eventually it'll sit back in place. Once that's in place and the volume buttons are kind of lined up as well, you can put in a screw on the top, a screw on the bottom, and then you can fill it in with the rest of the middle screws. Make sure the switch works fine and the volume buttons work fine as well, and then line up that wireless charging and make sure that that's sitting pretty much flat. Like I was saying with the microphone, we can now put that little cover over it. It kind of sits like this. And then we grab the Y000 bit, put in the bottom right screw, and then put in the top left screw. And the next thing I'm going to do is put in this charging port. It is a little bit off camera, but pretty much what we're going to do is we're going to line it up like this and make sure that the port is sitting flush in there. And then we're going to use these bottom two screws to plug in the port and make sure that it sits in there properly. Next, we're going to put all the standoff bits in the respective areas that they're supposed to go. Again, sorry that I did this a little bit off camera, but these pretty much just go in the areas that they were supposed to go. And hopefully you remember exactly where they go. Then we can put this little metal piece right here. But before we put in the Taptic engine, there is a Y000 screw that goes in the left side, and then the Taptic engine sits there. And before we forget it, on the right side, we can put that Y000 screw back in place, the other one right here, and then the speaker that sits like this. And then remember, the top standoff screw goes there. Then we can plug in the PH000 screws that go right here and right here. Ignore the placement that you see on the bottom because that's not done properly, but what we're going to do is we're going to put the logic board back in place and kind of line it up, and then we're going to use the standoff bits to make sure that the logic board stays in place. And then at this point I realized I finished the charging port too early, and what we do is we want to plug in this cable right here onto the charging port. And if you haven't already, put in the bottom three screws like you see right here. For some reason I forgot to talk about that, so sorry about that. The next thing you want to do is line up the battery. So we're going to just sit it in like this, and then we can plug this, and then we can finish the charging port area. But also you got to remember to put that little plastic piece that goes next to the battery. So maybe you want to do that before you put in the battery, and maybe you want to add some adhesive before you put in the battery, but I like to do that differently. I don't know why. Either way, you want to put a little bit of adhesive on the top portion and a little bit of adhesive on the bottom portion, and then you want to just set that battery down in place. You also want to remember to put the charging port cable holder that's on the right side. You want to remember to put that piece and those two screws that go there. And in the midst of all of that, I plugged in the charging port with both of the cables, so make sure to do that. And we're going to put the Face ID back in place, starting with it latching into the right side and then hooking in on the left side. Then we can feed these cables, make sure they're lined up properly, and plug them into the device. Then we want to make sure that the camera area is very clean and there's no dust or anything like that in there. And we'll clean that out, and then we'll set the camera back in place. Next, we're going to put the camera cover as well as the screw that goes right here, and then the screw that goes right here. And then we're going to put this flex cable cover over these flex cables right here. And then we're going to put the screw on the top and the screw on the bottom as well. Make sure not to over tighten this, or else that little metal piece can move a little bit. Now that we have pretty much everything plugged in, I recommend plugging in the battery last, but what I did is I plugged it in right here, and I put in these 2 screws as well as that little metal piece, obviously. And then we're going to plug in all the screen cables, make sure they're sitting in properly. Then we're going to put this metal panel over and put in all 6 of those screws. Now before we put it back together, we want to power it on, make sure it's working. And so far it looks like it's good, so what we're going to do is we're going to clip in all the edges, and we're going to put in the bottom 2 screws and make sure that everything is good. And there we are. Everything looks good, front looks good, the back looks good, and it looks like a new phone now. Hopefully this video helped you out. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments section or message me on Twitter. I get bored over there. Feel free to follow me on the social media listed above, subscribe to my channel so you can see more videos like this, as well as some review videos, and hit that bell button so then YouTube reminds you when those videos do come out. Thanks for watching.